Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Nahmadu wa nusalli ala rasulil kareem, amma ba'd. Fa'auzu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Rabbi zidni ilma, Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli waj'al li waziran min ahli. Rabbana taqabbal minna. Ameen. So we are doing the very inspiring and beautiful story of Ibrahim AS. Today, what we are going to be studying is a section from Surah Saaffaat. This is in Juz 23. And we are going to start from ayat number 83. But I'm going to go back a couple of ayats so that we can connect with the previous ayat and see what does Allah Ta'ala tell us there. So just before the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam starts here, there is the story of Nuh alayhi salam. So I'm just going to read the Arabic of the story of Nuh alayhi salam. Nuh prayed to us. See how excellent was our response to his prayer. We delivered him and his people from the mighty distress and made his progeny means offspring, children, to be the only survivors. So I want you to understand the sequence and the connection, because what we are going to be talking about is who was Ibrahim alayhi salam? Where did his people originally come from? Not his people specifically, but who were the offspring of Nuh alayhi salam? So Allah SWT says, we delivered him, meaning Nuh alayhi salam, and his people from the mighty distress and made his progeny, made his offspring to be the only survivors. And we left his good name among the later generations. Salamun ala Nuhin fil alameen. Salutations to Nuh among the people of the worlds. Inna kadhalika najzil muhsinin. Thus do we reward the righteous. Innahu min ibadina al-mu'minin. Surely he was one of our believing devotees, believing servants, believing worshippers. Thumma aghraqna al-akharin. Then the rest we drowned in the great flood. And then starts the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam, as narrated in this part of the Quran. So Surah As-Saaffaat. وَإِنَّ مِن شِيعَتِهِ لَإِبْرَاهِيمَ. Surely Ibrahim belonged to the first group who followed Nuh's way. So what does this tell us? So what do we understand? With Nuh alayhi salam, we know from these ayats that Allah SWT had saved all of the believers who were with Nuh alayhi salam, and the rest had been wiped out by the flood. And now Allah SWT is telling us that those mu'mineen, those muslimin, those Muslims, believers of their time with Nuh alayhi salam, so we understand that obviously time passed, they married, they spread around. So all of the generations that are following after that are actually coming from those believers. But as time passed, people again lose connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They again started listening to shaitan's influence, to their own nafs. They became disconnected with their faith. And so over time, over generations, again, shirk, polytheism crept in. But really, if you think about it, all who were left after Nuh alayhi salam's flood were the believers. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us that Ibrahim alayhi salam is from that group. He's from that group of believers. We read in detail last week the story of how he broke all the idols in his country when the people were away for an event. So this part of the Quran also narrates that briefly, but it doesn't go into the details. Why? Because you will see that in Surah Saaffaat, the focus is on a different part of the story. So this part of the story is now going to be about how he sacrifices Ismail alayhi salam, his son. But again, for reference, These ayahs give a little bit of that reference here. So how does this part start? إِذْ جَاءَ رَبَّهُ بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ. When he came to his Rabb with a pure heart, with a sound heart. Qalbin Salim, it's whole, it's intact, meaning spiritually, the heart is fully devoted to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When you commit shirk, when you have many gods, when you are afraid of many, then they take hold of bits and pieces of your heart. But he was fully devoted only to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He was on Tawheed. His love was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The one he feared was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The one he turned to was Allah. The one he begged from was Allah. The one he wanted guidance from was Allah. The one he wanted rizq, food, nutrition, wealth, family was all just Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. His north was Allah ta'ala. So his heart was intact. Nobody besides Allah had taken hold of his heart. You know, sometimes what we love tells us what has taken hold of our hearts. For some of us, we are so in love with our possessions. Look at my new Porsche. Look at my new house. Look at the business I have. Look at my wife or my husband or my children. Look at what I did. And we love them more than we love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So for the sake of those things that we love, we disobey Allah. How many times do fathers commit crimes for the sake of their children? We hear stories every day of, I think the last few years, it's been in the news of actors who have been cheating, trying to get their kids into Ivy League schools in the US. So much of political corruption is being done for the sake of my wife, of my kids. He had his heart set on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So a brief reference to the earlier times is قَالَ لِأَبِيهِ وَقَوْمِهِ مَاذَا تَعْبُدُونَ. Behold, he said to his father and to his people, what are these that you worship? So he's asking, he's questioning, trying to make them think rationally. أَإِفْكًا آلِهَةً دُونَ اللَّهِ تُرِيدُونَ. Would you serve false gods instead of Allah? فَمَا ظَنُّكُمْ بِرَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. What is your idea about the Rabb of the worlds? So because we discussed in detail all of these and the psyche behind worshipping the idols and the strategies that he uses to engage with his people, the courage that he shows as a young man when he confronts the belief systems of his father, his people, his king. So I'm not going to go into the details here. فَنَظَرَ نَظْرَةً فِي النُّجُومِ فَقَالَ إِنِّي سَقِيمٌ. Then he looked at the stars one time and he said, I'm feeling sick. فَتَوَلَّوْا عَنْهُ مُدْبِرِينَ. So his people left him behind and went away to their national fair. فَرَاغَ إِلَىٰ آلِهَتِهِمْ فَقَالَ أَلَا تَأْكُلُونَ. He sneaked into the temple of their gods and he addressed them. What does he say? أَلَا تَأْكُلُونَ. Why don't you eat from the offerings before you? You know what happens when people have these statues and gods that they have created out of wood or stone or marble, and they have put them in temples. What happens then? What happens is that usually there are these priests who are responsible for the temple, and they tell all of the worshippers to bring and present gifts to these false gods. And sometimes these gifts are in the form of food items, for example, milk, food, flowers. Sometimes they can be really expensive gifts like gold and silver and money. Basically, this is how those temple priests control the general population. This is how they make them vulnerable, by making them believe that this stone statue controls your destiny. So you must please him, you must bring offerings. And then who uses those offerings? Obviously, it's the priests, right? So imagine this temple And there must have been food or milk or something else in front of those statues. So he's saying, "Ala ta'kulun? Why don't you eat from these offerings before you? Why are you not eating?" Are the stone statues or wood statues going to respond? No. So then he says, "Ma lakum la tantiqun?" What is the matter with you that you don't speak? Then what happens? فَرَاغَ عَلَيْهِمْ ضَرْبًا بِالْيَمِينِ. Then he fell upon them, smiting them with his right hand. So he breaks them. Last week, the story that we had read from another part of the Quran, it goes into more details about whom he broke, how he left the largest of them. That part is not the focus here in Surah As-Saaffaat. A brief reference is being made. Then what happened? فَأَقْبَلُوا إِلَيْهِ يَزِفُونَ. Then the people came running to the scene. قَالَ أَتَعْبُدُونَ مَا تَنْحِتُونَ. Would you worship that which you have carved with hands, he said. So again, he's trying to make them realize the folly of their own actions. He's making them think. He's asking them questions. And then he says, وَاللَّهُ خَلَقَكُمْ وَمَا تَعْمَلُونَ قَالُوا ابْنُوا لَهُ بُنْيَانًا فَأَلْقُوهُ فِي الْجَحِيمِ. So he said, when Allah is the one who created you and that which you have, what was their response? Obviously, they have no response to the intelligent way he's bringing up these issues. He's trying to make them aware of their folly. They cannot respond because their belief is not based on anything that's rational. It's not evidence-based. So what is their response? They want to shut that voice. They don't want to listen to him. And because they have no argument in response to his arguments, they resort to force. Forcibly oppress the voice of reason. Forcibly stop him from expressing his opinion, from asking the questions to which they find no evidence and no answers. So what do they say? They said to one another, prepare for him a furnace. Bunyana, a building. Build him a furnace and throw him into the blazing flames. Again, this part of the story doesn't tell us the next steps, just the conclusion. We know from last week's story that we read how they had built it, how they had thrown him into the fire, and how Allah SWT had commanded the fire to become peace and coolness for Ibrahim AS. Here, the Quran just refers to the conclusion of that event. So Allah SWT says, فَأَرَادُوا بِهِ كَيْدًا فَجَعَلْنَاهُمُ الْأَسْفَلِينَ. Thus did they scheme against him, but we humiliated them all in their scheme. Imagine the scheming. Imagine the hundreds or thousands of people in his homeland, the city, the king with all of his might, the guards, the armies that he must have had at his disposal. Imagine his own father against him. Usually, it's not that difficult to kill somebody, we find. Every day we hear in the news, somebody just accidentally hit somebody with a car and the person died. We hear stories of how hitmen take out prominent people just with a single shot. Sometimes people accidentally, and the other person dies. That's what had happened with Musa. But here, what are you seeing? The whole country trying to kill a certain one single individual. Thousands of people come together and are collectively trying to take out one Ibrahim AS. And Allah SWT says, we humiliated them in their scheme. Why? Because life and death is only in Allah's hand. Nobody can kill us. nobody can keep us alive. So all of them, with all of their numbers and power and might and authority, could not take out this young man. What happens then? This is the focus of today's story. وَقَالَ إِنِّي ذَاهِبٌ إِلَىٰ رَبِّي سَيَهْدِينِ. Ibrahim said, I'm going to take refuge with my Rabb. He will surely guide me. So he decides to leave the city of Ur in what we call present-day Iraq. It is said that at that time, he left with his wife Sarah, alayhi salam, and his nephew Lut, alayhi salam, who later on also becomes a prophet. So what was the point of staying there any longer? He had tried his best with those people. Now it was time to immigrate, to do hijrah for the sake of Allah SWT. So he does hijrat. He leaves the land where he was born, he was raised, he left his family, he left his home, he left his people. Why? Because the love of his life was Allah SWT. You know, sometimes when people immigrate today, what do they immigrate for? Does anybody want to share? When people move from one country to another, why do they move? What are they looking for?
A better life, like job opportunities.
Yeah, exactly. Like education, job opportunities, to make more money, sometimes for security, because of wars that are raging in their regions. He moved for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He left his home for Allah, to find a place where Allah would take him, where Allah would command him to settle, where Allah would guide him to go. So with Sarah alayhi salam and with Lut alayhi salam, he leaves. He did not have a child with Sarah alayhi salam at that time. But Allah SWT narrates one of his du'as. We read a lot of his du'as, you know, in our everyday life. And one of his du'as here is, Rabbi habli minas salihin. Oh my Rabb, grant me a righteous son. Nobody has listened to him in his community. But he's not giving up. He's saying, okay, they don't listen. Allah, you give me a son. I will pass on your message and your love, your tawheed, this concept of one God, to the next generation. Give me a son. I will make him a Muslim. فَبَشَّرْنَاهُ بِغُلَامٍ حَلِيمٍ. So we gave him the good news of a gentle son. And who is this? This is now Ismail alayhi salam. He is born from Hajara alayhi salam, or Hajar or Hagar sometimes, as we say in English. So that part of the story about how he goes to Makkah, how he takes Hajara alayhi salam and the young baby Ismail to Makkah, is not narrated here. But because it's so integral to the continuation of our story, I'm going to switch to another part of the Quran, and I'm going to read from there. So Hajara alayhi salam was the second wife of Ibrahim alayhi salam. He and his first wife, Sarah alayhi salam, had been unable to have children for many years. And for years, they carried the message of Allah throughout the land of Sham, which is called Greater Syria today. So they were living kind of a nomadic life, and they were traveling. When both of them were very old, they would eventually be blessed with a son named Ishaq alayhi salam. But now, this is much earlier in his life. So while they were living in Egypt, Sarah alayhi salam suggested that Ibrahim alayhi salam should marry her servant Hajar or Hajara. And it's from Hajara alayhi salam that Ibrahim alayhi salam has his first child, Ismail alayhi salam. So we have this beautiful story of how Ibrahim alayhi salam left Hajara and Ismail in the desert. And we see this in one of the books of the Tafasir that explain this story. And this is called Tafsir Ibn Kathir. So according to this Tafsir, Ibrahim alayhi salam traveled to a place called Bakkah. The Quran also calls it Bakkah. Today, that place is called Makkah. So Bakkah was the old name of Makkah. He traveled to Bakkah with his young family. We know that when Ibrahim AS brought his wife and little baby son Ismail, Bakkah was an empty desert. No one had settled there, and there was no water. Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu narrates that Ibrahim AS made them sit over there near the Kaaba, and he placed near them a leather bag containing some dates and a small water skin containing some water. You know, like in those days, we didn't have water bottles, but you have seen in the movies, for example, if you have ever seen movies of the Old West, people used to carry bags made of animal skin, and they would keep their water in that. And then what happens? Ibrahim alayhis salam sets back homeward. And Ismail alayhis salam's mother, Hajara, she follows him. She says, "Oh Ibrahim, where are you going? Leaving us in this valley where there is no person whose company we might enjoy, nor is there anything to enjoy?" She repeated that to him many times. He does not look back at her. So then she asked him, she says, "Has Allah ordered you to do that?" And he said, "Yes." She said, "Then He will not neglect us." So this is not a story only of Ibrahim alayhis salam's love for Allah and obedience to Allah. It is also the story of the same thing with Hajara alayhis salam, the same thing with Ismail alayhis salam. They were all Muslim. They all submitted to Allah. So when she understood that he is not leaving of his own accord, but by Allah's command, she's at peace. She has no problem being left alone in the desert with her baby son. So she returned, and Ibrahim alayhis salam left. Can we even imagine the strength of Ibrahim alayhis salam at that point when he walks away? This is the little baby son that he had been asking for, and finally he has the baby, and Allah tells him to leave them in Bakkah. And can we even imagine the absolute trust of Hajara alayhis salam when she realizes that this is a command from Allah? Where is she? She's in the middle of nowhere, in a desert, with very little food and water, and she has complete tawakkul, complete trust in Allah. They have no material means of survival there, apparently, but she's not worried, and she does not hesitate for a second in surrendering to his plan. She believes that no matter what, he will take care of them. So she turns and she walks back to her spot where there's a pouch of dates and a few drinks of water, and she sits down beside her baby, completely certain that Allah will never abandon her. Allah SWT tells us in the Quran, "And whosoever puts their trust in Allah, then He will suffice him." Rasulullah SAW told us, if you were to truly rely upon Allah with reliance that is due to Him, if you give the haqq of that reliance, if you give that reliance its due right, then He would provide for you just as He provides for the birds. They go out in the morning with empty stomachs and they return full. So Hajara alayhis salam truly believed that Allah was sufficient for her and that He would provide for her just as He provides for the birds. She knew that although she and Ismail alayhis salam appeared to be alone in the desert, Allah was close by. So what do we learn? If there are no means in sight, remember Allah is close by. All risk, all sustenance, all security, all safety, all life, all death, all ease, all danger, all the problems come from Him alone. He is the only one who controls. So what happens? Ibn Abbas, one of Prophet Muhammad's relatives and one of the great Sahaba, he narrates this story in the Hadith. Ismail's mother went on suckling Ismail and drinking from the water. When the water in the water skin bag had all been used up, she became thirsty, and her child also became thirsty. She started looking at him, tossing in agony. You know, when you become really thirsty, imagine a really hot day, and imagine you've run out of water, and what happens then? For some time, there's enough water in your body that you don't feel the thirst very badly. But when you start getting dehydrated and more dehydrated, then it becomes agonizing. And when it came to that stage, she left him. She couldn't endure looking at him any longer. She found that the mountain of As-Safa was the nearest mountain to her on that land. And what is Safa? So Safa and Marwa are the two little mountains next to the Haram today, where we do sa'i, where we run between Safa and Marwa. So this was the nearby mountain. Basically, she's looking for a high place so that she can go up and she can take a look around, see, if she can find some people or some food or water source. You can imagine how she's trying to now save her life and her baby's life. So she's making that effort. She stood on it. So where does she go? She goes on Safa. She stood on it and she started looking at the valley keenly. So she might see somebody, but she can't see anybody. Then she descends from Al-Safa. And when she reached the valley, she tucked up her robe because now she's realizing there's nobody here that she can see. So she tucks up her robe because she is trying to use up as much of her energy as she possibly can quickly, efficiently. So she's going to start running now. She ran in the valley like a person in distress and trouble until she crossed the entire valley and reached Al-Marwa mountain. So on the other side of the valley is Marwa, where she stood and she started looking, expecting to see somebody, but she could not see anybody. Hajar or Hajara alayhi salam ran between Safa and Marwa 7 times. And each time she searched the desert expecting to see somebody. Subhanallah, despite being in the midst of an unsettled, uncultivated desert, she did not lose hope that Allah would send her help. We can't imagine the pain that she might have been feeling at that time. Imagine, all moms love their kids. Why? Because they've actually born the kids in their bellies and they've taken care of them after their birth. But who the moms are most vulnerable and gentle and caring about are the young newborn babies, because they know that they need most help, they need most care. And imagine that even in that stage, she is holding on, she's firm in her belief that Allah is not going to neglect them. And it was an act of trust so powerful that the Ummah of Muhammad ﷺ commemorated to this day every year at Hajj. Do you know that when we go for Hajj, so this is the season of Hajj now, and so many from the Muslim Ummah are in Makkah right now for Hajj. And when we go either for Umrah or for Hajj, during that, one of the rituals is called Sa'i. Sa'i means to strive. And that is, we take 7 rounds between Safa and Marwa. And the women walk and the men, they run. Who are these men and women today? And this will continue till Qiyamah, till the end of time, inshallah. As long as Hajj goes on, Umrah goes on. Whose sunnah, whose tradition are these men running in? It is the sunnah of Hajara alayhi salam at this point in time, when she was searching for the water for baby Ismail. This is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala honors the sabr, the patience, the tawakkul, the trust of a Muslim woman, a mother. Sometimes we don't understand how much Allah honors women in Islam. So when Hajara alayhi salam had run between the mountains 7 times, she heard a voice as she was standing on Marwa. And she forces herself to be quiet, and she heard the voice again. So she called out. She said, "You have made me hear your voice. Have you got something to help me?" She can't see anybody, but she can hear. After calling out, she saw an angel at the place where now the Zamzam well is situated. At that time, there was no well, there was no water there that she could see. But she sees Angel Jibreel standing there.